conversation before this panel number one, was incredibly stimulating, and there were lots of questions. Now we're going to talk about English-speaking Quebec in the face of change. With the next Quebec election just months away, what does the English-speaking community need, and how should we position ourselves for optimal success in ensuring these needs are met? We heard some observations in the last panel. This panel will deliberate the key asks on critical files like employment, education, racialized communities, not-for-profit funding, and others that they may bring up. Moderating this panel is another longtime colleague and friend, Lorraine O'Donnell. Lorraine is an affiliate assistant professor with Concordia University School of Community and Public Affairs and a research associate at the Quebec English-speaking Communities Research Network, QUESCREN. The name stuck, Lorraine. People now know what QUESCREN is. It's terrific. Where since 2008, she has led day-to-day operations. QUESCREN provides opportunities to promote the understanding and vitality of Quebec's English language minority communities through research, training, knowledge mobilization, networking, and outreach. Dr. O'Donnell's own research focus is history heritage projects that involve and help build communities. I'm going to also introduce other members of our panel. Tino Bordonaro is the chairperson of the Advisory Board on English Education, ABI, at the Ministère de l'Éducation du Québec. He has also been teaching courses on educational policy, classroom pedagogy, oh, it's easier for me to say it in French than in English, and school administration at McGill University since 1991. And between 2010 and 2019, he was responsible for the social services program at the English Montreal School Board. Born in Montreal, Tino completed his undergraduate studies at Bishop's University and holds an MA from McGill University. He's fluent in 3 languages and enjoys reading and traveling whenever possible. Kassandra Kernisan holds an MBA from HEC Montréal and a Bachelor of Commerce from McGill University with a specialization in marketing. She has 15 years of experience in corporate marketing, business management, nonprofit leadership, and entrepreneurship. She is currently the executive director of DESTA Black Youth Network, a charitable organization that offers access to a hub of services and partnerships that empower the Black community through programs rooted in social and economic justice. DESTA is an affiliate member with the QCGN and has been doing work with us on something you'll see a little later, the Access to Justice Project. Nicholas Salter is the executive director of the Provincial Employment Roundtable, a nonprofit multi-stakeholder initiative focused on addressing the employment and employability challenges facing Quebec's English-speaking community. Prior to directing the Provincial Employment Roundtable, PERT, Nick helped launch and build McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. Nick has been working in policy and communications for close to 15 years and has extensive experience working with foundations, boards, community organization, and the healthcare system, higher education, multiple levels of government. So a very polyvalent experience. He holds an MSW in International and Community Development, a BA in Psychology, and a graduate certificate in PR. A past fellow of McGill Institute for Health and Social Policy. Kimberly Buffitt from the Coasters Association, where she says it's stormy today. She can tell you how far that is from where we are today. She joined the Coasters in 2004 and has led and managed the network and partnership initiative through Community Health and Social Services Network since 2014. In 2020, she took a more active role in operations of the Coasters Association, supporting the executive director in restructuring the operation functions of the Coasters Association due to its rapid expansion and growth. Coaster's a proud, I hope proud. We're proud to have Coasters as a member of the QCGN. Her involvement with communities of the lower North Shore allowed her the opportunity to be in close contact with partners and on and off the territory. She's built part relationships, empowered others, and worked to develop programs and services across territory through open dialogue and facilitated discussion. She's committed to putting the community's interests first as she lobbies and networks on behalf of the population of Lower North Shore. A very interesting work that the Coasters does is that they do continue to advocate for their own local needs, but are interested in the rest of the English-speaking community across the province. Thank you. I pass it over to you, Lorraine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, QCGN, for inviting me to moderate this amazing panel. And welcome to everyone who's attending today. You are very welcome to write in the chat who you are and where you're from so that we have a sense of who's in the room. As Sylvia mentioned, our panel today is called English Speaking Quebec in the Face of Change. And the goal of this 1 hour is to present and discuss issues and priorities from diverse viewpoints in English-speaking Quebec. Some answers will also be proposed to identify where efforts and support are needed. And the focus will be on issues, not punditry or politics. And through this, we aim to inform stakeholders and governments, community members, the general public and media of these important issues. So we're meeting for an hour until 11:45, and here's the timeline. Each of the 4 speakers will present for 5 minutes, and I do remind the speakers to try to respect the timeline. I'll then moderate a discussion between them for something like 20-25 minutes, and then there will be around 10 minutes, timing permitting, for a Q&A with the audience. People can write that in the Q&A section of the chat. Oh, it's not of the chat. It's actually a separate bubble there at the bottom of your screen. So with no further ado, I invite Tino Bordonaro to speak.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this session and with such distinguished panelists. My focus will be on recent educational policy and, of course, its implications on Quebec education. Specifically, I will address 3 provincial bills, namely Bill 40, Bill 21, and, of course, Bill 96. In short, this brief presentation will focus on educational governance, religion, and language. In February of 2020, the Quebec government passed Bill 40. Bill 40 converted school boards to school service centers. However, Bill 40 does not apply to the 9 English school boards because of a court injunction. Nonetheless, there are some significant questions regarding this bill. Firstly, school boards in Quebec are democratic institutions, and prior to Bill 40, the entire Quebec English community could elect their commissioners. However, if English school boards become school service centers, then the vote will be available to parents only. Don't get me wrong, parents play an instrumental role in the administration of schools. At issue here is what is in the best interest of both parents and the English community. A public education system is beneficial because everybody benefits, students, parents, and the community. Therefore, it raises the first question: who should determine how a school board is governed? Again, parents or the community, or both? Secondly, Section 23 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms gives educational rights to minority language communities in Canada. In Quebec, these rights rest with the English community. That is, the English community has the right to manage their own schools. Therefore, by limiting the vote to parents, does this violate the constitutional rights of the English community? Does the Quebec government have the authority to change how English school boards are governed, or does this authority rest with the very English communities? Regarding religion, since the 1960s, Quebec has been on a long road to secularize the education system. The provision that is educationally noteworthy in Bill 21 is the prohibition that new teachers wear religious symbols. To avoid a constitutional challenge, that is, whether Bill 21 infringes upon religious rights, it was passed invoking the notwithstanding clause. Again, there are several questions that are worthy of our attention. Firstly, how will the Quebec government reconcile the principle of secularism and the protection of religious rights? Secondly, should the notwithstanding clause be used preemptively? And lastly, since a notwithstanding clause expires after 5 years, but may be renewed indefinitely, is it the intent of the government to renew it? The third law that I would like to address is the recently adopted Bill 96. Bill 96, as we all know, is an amendment to Bill 101, and therefore, like many laws, it is a comprehensive one. I will address specifically the provisions that affect temporary residents and the CEGEP students. Bill 96 limits the exemption for temporary residents to 3 years with no option for renewal. Therefore, the question is, how will the government encourage foreign temporary workers from considering Quebec? And how will these workers be encouraged to stay in Quebec? Regarding CEGEPs, Bill 96 limits the proportion of students attending English CEGEPs, requires that some students pass mandatory French language exams in order to graduate, and that students take 3 courses in French or French second language. Again, Bill 96 raises many questions. Regarding the enrollment cap in English CEGEPs, would it not be more beneficial to make higher education more accessible? Will these changes lower students' performance, thus making it harder for CEGEP graduates to enroll in university? And under these conditions, how will the government support student success, an often cited priority of the Quebec Ministry of Education, as well as of higher education? These are the questions that immediately come to mind, and there are more which I no doubt will be raised later in this forum, and I look forward to addressing them. Thank you, and I hope I kept this under 5 minutes.
You did. Thank you, Tino. You set the bar high. I now invite Kimberly Buffitt to speak. Hi, Kim.
Hi, I was going to put on a timer. I'm a horrible speaker of 5 minutes, as anybody who knows me. So I'm going to start my timer. So I'm going to go on a very different angle. We're from a very, very isolated rural part of Quebec. So we're probably one of the most remote regions as part of the QCGN. So I'm going to touch on some of that isolation. For us, it's really about, I'm going to speak on Bill 96. And the ramifications of that and the lack of access to programs that the regions have. Because what happened when all of Quebec constructed its programs, whether it was a Maison de Famille or it was CABS or it was all of these centers, what we've seen is the English community is not very included in any of those programs and services in the regions. Then it comes to bear as you go into changing education laws, if you're changing franchisation and all of these things. How do unilingual Anglophone communities promote French in their villages when they do not have access to programs? They don't have access to extra regional, extra services, because they were kind of left out of all of those pockets. So when you see all of the community-based programs that are supposed to help and integrate, say, into French, or you're going to do an after-school program, or you're going to do any of those things, the regions don't have access. What we've also seen is prior to, in the last year, we were getting a lot of access from programs from Services Canada. There was a decentralization down to Services Quebec of Services Canada programs. And then what ended up happening is because of the designations, I'll call it in Quebec, like say for the coasters, I'll give that as an example. We were told, you don't have an employability mandate, although we did employability for 30 years because we weren't recognized as an access point. So there's a very big disconnect between the Quebec government and the English minority community groups and what they do, their multi-sectorial mandates, all of those things. So then it begs to question, how are you going to support the English community to integrate into such bills as like Bill 96? So you're asking them to learn more French. You're the business sector, you're asking, some companies now are going to be under a franchisation certificate. How are you going to implement those programs when the structure is not there? And I think there's a lot of logistics that the Quebec government is going to have to work out in the regions, because there's not multi-points of service that you can go and get. And also the time limits to learn a second language when you're unilingual. And I would also put to the point of like our elderly workforce in the region. You may be 50 years old and you don't know how to speak French. How are they going to teach somebody French in the adult sector, and all of these programs that would be a necessity now to companies like fish plants that employ multi groups that are unilingual. So I think these big questions, I think, have to be answered and have to be more clear to communities and the people that end up having to deliver programs when the government is absent. And what you'll see in the regions is the community groups have taken on the role of what were supposed to be government funded programs because they don't exist. So that would be my main topic. I've stayed in under 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Kassandra Kernisan, you're up. Hi, Kassandra.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me today. I don't have a timer, so please stop me if I go over. I don't think I will, though. I'm really coming from the perspective of the Black English-speaking community in Montreal. So we're a double minority community. So yes, you know, the issue of language is very big in this province, but you know, this is my community. This is the community that I'm coming from. I'm speaking from, you know, a personal experience as well as my professional experience. And I think the bigger issues, or the issues that are more difficult to tackle, are the issues surrounding race and systemic racism within the province. So, you know, when we look at just the history of how this system was built, everything is really embedded in that. So, you know, there's the lack of access to networks. There's the history of segregation, discrimination, and racism. So that exclusion is something that is still very much a challenge for the Black English-speaking community today. And then you bring in, you know, the intersectionality of also them being English speaking. So being further marginalized and being further excluded from access, it becomes very challenging. So I think a lot of the issues that I want to really focus on today are, you know, the bigger issues, really like those things that are going to be a little bit harder to tackle and to overcome, but that are very real for the community. And just to share a few statistics, and this is really around employability, but this is not limited to employment. This is all spheres of society in which the Black community are, you know, excluded and are lacking access. But just speaking of employability, when you look at the overall unemployment rate among people with a university degree, it's around just under 6%. And when you break down this figure, you see that among visible minorities, this rate jumps up to 10.2% versus 4.3% for non-visible minorities. So there's obviously a huge gap that's related to race. That really does need to be addressed. And I think when we look at, you know, a lot of people will say, oh, you know, it's a matter of skills training, it's a matter of education, but this is with all other things, you know, on a level playing field. So these statistics really speak clearly to the issues that still exist within the society. And again, going back to why there are these huge gaps, the history of systemic discrimination and racism, barriers to employment, just a lack of strong business networks within the community or access to wider networks for the community, a lack of Black-owned businesses in the community, and of course, social disadvantages. And some of the possible solutions, which again are bigger picture solutions, which I think that, slowly we are working towards as a society, are really encouraging employment equity programs, really implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives in workplaces, encouraging and developing entrepreneurship and investment within the Black community. Another point that's really important is just raising the public awareness of the contributions of Black English-speaking communities to the economic and social development of Quebec. And I think this is a point that is really huge because there have been so many contributions that I think are overlooked or downplayed, and this is something I would really like to see more of, especially coming from the government. And I think, we didn't get into the issues of social justice and things like that, but there are huge issues there as well. So I think, being able to arm the community with legal resources as well to be able to fight discrimination from a legal standpoint are going to be really important. So I hope I didn't go over time, but
Your timing is perfect. Thank you, Kassandra. Wow. Nicholas, keep it up. Hi, Nicholas Salter.
Hi, it's going to be tough. PERT's done about 20 reports in the last year, so it's a big challenge to boil it down into 5 minutes, but I know there'll be discussion later as well. So I actually wanted to start by providing a bit of context, so 3 pieces of context. The first may actually be unsurprising to some in the audience, but it does go against the myth of English speakers in Quebec as a wealthy, homogeneous elite. And we've seen that myth be reinvoked a number of times over the last year. So I think it's worth repeating, particularly when it comes to employment. So English speakers face challenges in Quebec's labor market. Our recent research showed that English speakers in Quebec face a 2% higher unemployment rate than French speakers, and also earn median incomes of about $2,800 less than French speakers. Now, those figures are actually from across the province. So there are administrative regions in Quebec where English speakers earn at least $4,000 less than French speakers. There are also regions in Quebec where the unemployment rate for English speakers is north of 20%. The second piece of context that I wanted to give you is about Quebec's economy. So Quebec's economy has actually been performing fairly well. And I'm going to set aside the inflation, the pain of inflation and high inflation that's hurting all of us. But Quebec, like many other jurisdictions, is actually also facing a labor shortage. So a survey last year that was conducted by the Conseil du patronat du Québec found that 94% of businesses said they were facing labor shortages, and half of them actually had to turn down potential new contracts because of this scarcity of workers. So many experts are actually worried about the impact this labor shortage will have on Quebec's economy and economic growth. And the third piece of context that I wanted to mention is just the lack of skills training and French language learning programs available for English speakers, especially once they have aged out of the standard education system and are in the labor market. So Kimberly was mentioning some of this in her remarks earlier. So the Quebec government has actually done a fairly commendable job identifying lifelong learning, employment services, skills training programs as a key to facing our current and future challenges in Quebec. So that's including potential other pandemics, economic crises, climate change, automation, and demographic challenges such as an aging population and a low birth rate. But linguistic minorities have actually been left out of this plan, largely left out of this plan. So English speakers in the labor market who are looking to learn French, upskill themselves, or switch careers, they struggle to find affordable and accessible training opportunities in Quebec. And this issue is even more evident in regions outside of Montreal, where English speakers represent a smaller percentage of the population. So why did I mention these 3 pieces of context? Because I think there's a fairly obvious win-win situation here, where Quebec's government can be making the necessary investments and commitments for employment services and skills training for Quebec's English-speaking community, which at the same time will enable our community to make a full contribution to Quebec's economy via better employment outcomes. And it's with this in mind that we've actually developed a series of recommendations that we would like to see all the political parties commit to in the upcoming election, and which we will believe will have both a positive impact on employment situation for English speakers, but also a net positive impact on Quebec's economy. So I'm going to highlight 3 of those for you today. The first is the expansion of English employment services. Yes, I said English employment services. Employment services play a crucial and important role in helping people enter, re-enter, and advance in the labor market. We believe there should be an expansion of funding and support for employment organizations currently delivering English employment services in Quebec, and that this funding should be proportionate to our size in the population. Moreover, this funding should be based on a hybrid model of core funding with additional funding based on the number of clients being served. And for the regions where there are perhaps more generalist organizations and less specialist employment service providers, we'd like to see the development of a dedicated fund for regional organizations to build their capacity, hire resources, deliver liaison, accompaniment, and translation services, which will enable English speakers in smaller regional communities to access the existing network of French employment services. Now, our second recommendation is on French language training. So with the upcoming development of French language training opportunities, as promised in Bill 96 with the creation of Francisation Québec, we want to ensure that French language training is developed to meet the needs of English speakers. What we don't want to see is a top-down bureaucracy-led system imposed on our communities. Therefore, we believe actually that a permanent consultative body made up of experts from the community should be created within this new institution structure. We also believe that the language training programs being developed under this new organization must be co-developed with the English-speaking community, and that, again, a dedicated fund be developed to ensure that our organizations are able to deliver their programs in their communities if they so wish. And finally, and Lorraine, I'm aware I got my own clock running. I'm just over 5 minutes here, so I'm going to cut this one a bit short, but we can't talk about employment in Quebec without talking about the public service. We know that's hovered around 1% annually, so English-speaking population participation in the public service has been around 1% annually with very little deviation or improvement. And what we want to see is a commitment to a firm target based on our percentage in the population, the development of work integrated learning opportunities, recruitment pipelines, and outreach efforts, internships, and even French language training programs in government so that English speakers can be hired and then improve their French on the job. And with that, I'll end my remarks and be happy to move to questions.
Thank you so much, Nick, and all the speakers. Very much appreciated. So I'm going to lead a round of 2 questions. And what I suggest for each panelist is that we do, a 1-minute reply each and then have a discussion of each. So we have 20 minutes, so 10 minutes per question to look at these. The first is education and training. I think it's really interesting that all the speakers touched on variety, different aspects of this. Obviously, education and training are where people should learn and also have the capacity to survive and thrive in the province. However, you've noted and included in notes that presenters sent to me prior to the event that there are issues around education. There are barriers to student success, for instance, studying French. Also, negative experiences at schools by young Black men, something that Kassandra mentioned she wanted to discuss. There are schools where students are socialized, but unfortunately in part, sometimes socialized to leave the province once they are educated. Another question is educational governance, which is a space where communities and institutions interact with the state. So given these points and more, what is your key recommendation to governments and stakeholders regarding education and training and English-speaking Quebec? So Kassandra, let's start with you. Just a minute, if you could give a little overview and then we'll have a discussion.
It's going to be challenging, but yes, I think, like you mentioned, there is, and I highlighted the experience of young Black men, male youth, I should say, because there's a tendency towards the criminalization at a very young age of, those members of our community. And I think, there's a phenomenon called it's more so coming from the US and other provinces in Canada, but it's the school to prison pipeline, which I think Quebec hasn't really started to look at things in this way. But the fact that, when you look at statistics, a much higher percentage of young Black males are being suspended, expelled, basically excluded from the educational system. I think on top of that, there are issues of representation. We don't see, they don't have mentors that look like them. They don't have educators that look like them. It's a very exclusionary experience for many Black members of the community. And I could speak about my experience at McGill, which was my first interaction with Montreal. It was a very exclusionary experience, as much as I'm grateful for that education and the opportunities that it opened up to me, there was a lot of that exclusion. And I think that needs to be addressed at all levels. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Kimberly, maybe you can weigh in.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on raising your children to leave Quebec, because it's a common phrase. And this is when we met with youth in the population that are in university, and they said their parents told them, get your education, get out of here, and don't come back. And as a child, when you're going through an education system, it's really sad that you think you can never come home. You have to think of that child leaving when they leave the Lorna Shore at 16 years old to go to Seja, because there's no post-secondary. They're leaving, almost being raised that they can never return. And it's a very almost like traumatic experience, because they've been raised that they don't belong in Quebec. And it's a culture thing that we have been working really hard to change, is that you can get educated. If you're English, you can still work in Quebec, and we're going to welcome you back. And I think Quebec has a lot of work to do, from even the trauma of Bill 110. This is historic. And now Bill 96. So they feel like the English in regions, and our region, feel that they're not wanted and they're not valued. And so I think in terms of education and, changing the culture that we want our children to be bilingual, we value the population, and that you have a place, because we've got a lot of work to do, because we have a very educated workforce. But they've moved away. And now how do we get them to come back to, like they touched on before, like the shortages in labor and all of that? We have them, they're just elsewhere in Canada. So, we have to see about integration and accompaniment and change the language that we're using, because the language that we're using right now is not very welcoming, and it makes you feel that you're an excluded part of the population. And I think this gets exasperated for us. Like, when you go from here to Montreal, then you've never been on the metro, you've never been on all of these things. It's a hard integration to go from a very rural community, an isolated community, to the city too, as well, right? So you have all of those plays that affect education, that affect your wanting to stay. And I think we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of repairing, and it's historical repairs. And this has kind of just, we were making momentum, improving, and we're set back again.
Thanks, Kim. Nicholas, do you have something to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So, our key recommendation here is actually just to invest in English language education programs and English language skills training and French language training programs for English speakers, but also adapt them to the reality of their communities, right? So there are some constraints at MTES around the number of people you need for programs. And what we don't see is a recognition that perhaps reaching those specific minimum targets might be difficult in some of our regional communities for English speakers, given the size of our population. So a bit of adaptability on the side of MTES in terms of how they decide programs can be introduced, but also the necessary investments. And I just wanted to add one interesting thing that we've been looking at is vocational schools. So I mentioned off the top the 2% unemployment gap. That suggests that in Quebec's labor market, English speakers are perhaps missing skills to meet the needs of the labor market. French language skills would perhaps be the obvious place where we have a barrier and challenge, and the community's told us that. But the other piece is vocational education. So actually, English speakers, in our research, we found that 6% of English speakers compared to 13% of French speakers have a vocational educational diploma. And that's a really interesting stat. So we engage in vocational education a lot less, but in an economy and in a tight labor market where reskilling is so important, the agility that vocational educational programs, those kind of certifications give us is pretty crucial. You can get a specific training for a specific job, and you can think about the regions as well and how important that is. So what we'd really like also to see is an investment in our vocational schools and those kind of programs, those agile kind of programs enable English speakers to get jobs.
Thanks very much, Nick. Something I've often thought about at university. People go to learn, say, about literature or philosophy, but they unfortunately don't have any marketable skills, or few. And it would be so great to see partnerships between universities and vocational programs to double equip people, at that level. And finally, Tino, do you have something to say on this question of your one key recommendation and regarding education?
Certainly, and I will avoid repeating the pertinent comments that have been raised. Personally, in my opinion, education should be governed as locally as possible. Kimberly made reference to this in her initial address. Therefore, school boards should not be converted into service centers, as this would further their centralizations. Also, in many Quebec communities, and especially in the regions, the English school board, and more so the English school, is one of the only English institutions that preserve the English language and the vitality of these communities. Regarding student success, I believe that initiatives should be introduced to establish a curriculum that is more relevant to Quebec's many English communities. Therefore, as well, the provincial assessment tool should be reassessed so that the evaluation does not become the Achilles heel of any forthcoming curriculum reform. Reforming how we evaluate in this province would also address student success. Too much is determined by the content and format of provincial evaluations. If the weight and nature of these evaluations is modernized, then pedagogical methods would change, and very likely improvements in student success would follow. Lastly, and more importantly, every effort should be made to address any form of racism in our schools, rather than to debate whether it is systemic, as it often is. Quebec does deserve schools that apply the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks. Kassandra, I see you have your hand up, and maybe you can wrap up this part of the discussion, and it'll segue into the next one, which has to do with diversity. Kassandra?
Sure. There was a point that I forgot to bring up, and actually Tino mentioned it, so I'm gonna go off of that. The curriculum, this is so important, especially for the Black community, because there's so much that is left out of the history books that is to a disservice to, all of the greatness of the Black community itself. This is, a lot of the curriculum is based on biased historical perspectives, obviously biased towards the ones who created the system at the expense of those who often suffer the obstacles and the barriers to accessing that system. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done from that perspective, and the Black community needs to be involved in that, revamp of the curriculums within the education system. So I think that's really important.
Thanks so much. By the way, Kassandra, I'll be in touch because a colleague and I, Patrick Donovan, and I are working on a project called People's History of English Speaking Quebec. And we'd like to reach out to DESTA. So the next question I have related to what you've already touched on. We know that Quebec is, English-speaking Quebec is extremely diverse in terms of ethnocultural makeup, regional, socioeconomic, and so on. Different populations within English-speaking Quebec face different challenges. So what is the most important challenge around diversity that your institution identifies? And what best practice would you like to see implemented or expanded to address the challenge? So let's go the other way around. Tino, do you have something to say about that?
Certainly. Regarding the issue of diversity, the advisory board published a brief on this very important topic in June of 2021. The greatest challenge is admitting that systemic racism exists. Without this admission, attempts to address it will face significant challenges and limitations. To address it, a definitive statement that any form of discrimination will not be tolerated in Quebec schools needs to be issued. To understand where and to what extent that discrimination exists, race-based data on student success, retention, as well as disciplinary actions must be collected and must be shared transparently. The establishment of equity committees in every school board and in every schools is a must. These committees would provide equity training that would, in turn, also provide meaningful conversations among the educational stakeholders. The reasons of, for reasons of transparency and accountability, the activities of these committees should be reported regularly and should be reported to the school community as well. To ensure that support services provided to the diversity of schools and Senate populations are equitable, differential funding subject to local discretion, with particular emphasis on the needs of diverse populations in small rural schools should be established. Again, the concept of decentralization and local control. The curriculum, enough cannot be said about the curriculum. The curriculum should be reformed to ensure that it is inclusive of diverse groups. Specifically, the history curriculum should be broadened to include perspectives beyond Quebec and to allow latitude so that schools can incorporate topics that are relative to their students' background and local history. Teacher education programs must ensure that they reflect the realities of the inclusive classroom and prepare teachers to work within these realities. And lastly, but nonetheless importantly, funding should be provided to existing community-based resource projects to develop initiatives to support programs that value, again, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thanks, Tino. Nicholas Salter, do you have comments? A single challenge around diversity and best practice? Tino, yours were great.
Well, I mean, I would like to echo what Tino said around race-based data. So the amount of data is fairly limited. So what we'd really like to see is Quebec regularly collect race-based and linguistic-based data to examine how English speakers are actually faring in Quebec and better identify the opportunities to improve their outcomes. We have been able to collect a bit of information, and I do think some of these stats are worth sharing because they're interesting. And we do say, we're not monolithic, we're homogeneous, but I think a better understanding of those is very helpful for people to be able to share that with their colleagues, neighbors, friends, etc. So Quebec's English-speaking community is the most diverse official language minority community in Canada in terms of ethnicity and race. So almost 1 in 3 English speakers in Quebec identify as visible minorities, compared to 9.7% of French speakers. We also know that 32.9% of English speakers in Quebec identify as immigrants, while 10% of French speakers identify as immigrants. So our diversity is really our strength. But as Kassandra mentioned earlier, there's this double minority status. So research shows that English speakers who are also visible minorities face other aspects of marginalization, such as being immigrants, and they face worse employment and socioeconomic outcomes, higher unemployment rates, lower incomes, and struggle to move through the education system. We partnered this year with the BCRC, so the Black Community Resource Center in Montreal, and the work we did with them found that Black survey respondents recalled receiving more incidents of discipline, humiliation, and public shaming by educators in school than survey respondents who did not belong to a visible minority. We also examined the differences between linguistic and racialized groups in Quebec, and what little data we found did speak to different income outcomes. So I know Kassandra touched on the unemployment rates, but for example, for English speakers, visible minorities, we saw incomes of 22,000 compared to English speakers who are non-visible minority of 29,800, so a $7,800 difference. French speakers, there's still a difference. So visible minorities, French speakers are 23,600. Non-visible minorities is 30,800. So non-visible minority French speaker. So that difference is smaller. It's 7,200 on the French side. But yeah, being a linguistic minority is already a challenge, and obviously it's more of a challenge when you introduce aspects of race, immigration, gender, and location. But the data we have is really limited. It's fairly limited to what I've kind of outlined today and what you've heard from Kassandra as well. So again, we really think to solve this problem, we need to better understand it. We need better data, and we need regularly collected data on race and language.
Thanks, Nick. And that question of reaching out to l'Institut de la Statistique du Québec is one that you and I have agreed we're going to have a chat about. Kimberly, about diversity, which can include regional diversity as well as socioeconomic.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on what Nick kind of touched on before, but really it's the population base and access to programs. And one of the famous ones I love to get up and give an example every time I'm asked to speak is the training. Like they ask for at least a minimum of 8 participants. So I'm going to give you an example of an isolated community like Kegaska. You would be asking 10% of their population. So I always love to say, is it the same requirement for Montreal? Because that means 253,000 people would have to go to a training session in order for it to be held. And is that fair? So that is the statistics that I'm going to give back to the government. So you're asking 10% of the population of a community on the Lorraine Shore to attend a training session in order for it to be held. Is that equitable access? No. And I think everybody agrees with that. And I asked one time we were in Ottawa, I said, was that just decided around a table? Like who made the decision? And then the other thing is the service providers, the money is decentralized down to each region. Then that region of office that may, for in our case, maybe in Sept-Îles or Baie-Comeau, is supposed to provide service across the territory. When that office is French only, how do they service the English population? And how is that monitored? How is it monitored if they're getting reach with their program? So there's 253 entities, according to the research done by the Secretariat, that are supposed to supply services to the population, let's say on the Lorraine Shore. How many are actually doing it? Like, is there data? And I would say no, because they're not measuring it in linguistic parameters. So I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of due diligence to see the barriers that we're facing in programs. And like I said, there's barriers and aspects of there's various barriers to rural populations that the policy does not fit, because the policy was constructed for an urban or like a suburban where you can drive to a city kind of reality, and it doesn't fit the regions.
Thanks, Kimberly. And Kassandra, most important challenge and a best practice you might recommend.
Yes, thank you. It's difficult to, really just talk about one, but I think my colleagues really touched on some really great points. So everything that was mentioned before, but I think I'm going to go back to what I said in the beginning, really putting the contributions of Black community members at the forefront. And I think, and I'm speaking for the Black community, but I think also for the Indigenous community as well. There's so much that is hidden from the story that really should be brought to light, because if we're going to start to dismantle the wrongs of the past, we really need to bring value to the cultural aspects, everything that members of the Black community and Indigenous communities have contributed to this society. So I think that's a really big one, in addition to everything my colleagues said about obviously race-based data, reforming the educational system. There are so many other aspects. Representation is a big one. So, I don't even like the word representation. It's really, being actively involved in all spheres of society. You know, you want to see diversity in all spheres of society so that everyone's voice is considered and heard. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have a good 5-6 minutes for questions from the audience. At this moment in the Q&A, so if I'll remind the audience members, there's the chat bubble, and then over to the right, at least on the bottom of my Zoom screen, is a Q&A section. Nobody has written any questions. So in the absence of that, I will turn to the panelists and ask if you have anything to ask each other or any extra comments to make while we wait for something in the Q&A. Let's go ahead and talk.
I'm going to just make a comment that I think in terms of even our own education institutions, because we were looking at trying to get more post-secondary education into the regions. And I think our English universities have a lot of work to do within Quebec themselves in getting out of their urban environments. And this is for CEGEPs as well to be, and we saw this with COVID. I think it's one of the good things is that we can now see that it can be done remote. And I think that we have as a community ourselves to do some internal work to expand our offer and our service reach to the regions and across Quebec so that there are other alternatives. And I think we have to look on ourselves as well.
Does that go to colleges too, Kim? Do you find that CEGEPs are doing good outreach, or they could improve their offer?
They definitely could improve, because you have to think like Quebec specialized their CEGEPs, and this is the same in the economic. Like I always refer to this in the English community, their Center for Technology Transfers, the Quebec tied their economic development to CCTTs. There's very little knowledge of that whole system within the English community. And I've done this at QCGN meetings and CHSSN and just said, does anybody even know what the acronym stands for? Crickets. You know, this is what Quebec is giving millions and millions of dollars to, and they've centralized all their economic development and innovation, and our community is not knowledgeable. So like, and this is tied to the CEGEP system. So we have a lot of work, because I feel like it's a siloed and we're outside of the system right now. And so if we're seeing the economic development problems and all of those issues, is it because, you know, we don't even have knowledge of the system? So I think, you know, that is attached to CEGEPs. There's the whole university system and research. And I think there has to be some kind of, there's got to be improvements.
Kim, you're making me think that one of the committee's QUESCREN chairs is called Interlevel Educational Table. And it would be good for us to, I'll make a note of it, to reach out to regional associations. We have the QCGN on board, but we could reach out to RDN and see, you know, because the Regional Development Association Network has a lot of the regional groups. So that's a next step. I see a question from Anna Kemp. Oh, all of a sudden there are 3 questions. We'll do what we can to have them answered. The first question is from Anna. There's no panelist presenting an Indigenous perspective. Does this indicate a weakness in our network? That's an interesting question. I'll throw that out to the panelists, but also Sylvia, who's in the room. Not to put anyone on the spot, but if someone has thoughts to answer that.
I would just mention that, I mean, I heard someone, or I saw it in the chat earlier, someone mentioned, you know, we're not talking about gender or sexual identity. And I think within our community as a whole, we also have to acknowledge that Indigenous perspectives based on gender, perspectives based on sexual identity, visible minorities, as we mentioned, immigrants, we need to do a better job inside our community, acknowledging those perspectives and also putting those you know, people who represent those various identities in positions of power as well. So I would just, more of a comment than a response to that question, but that's what comes to my mind.
Thanks, Nick. I see.
Lorraine, if you want me to.
Yes, it's.
I'm going to, yeah. Did you see me? Yeah, okay. Our relationship with the Indigenous community, the English-speaking segment of the English-speaking community, is just beginning. And you were absolutely right. We need to work on that. And it's one of the reasons that we have started our renewal project, where we're widening our network, where we're expanding our tent. And I take that as an excellent point. They have been working with us. We have been working together with Bill 96. So we have doors open. We have the beginnings of relationships. And I think that's something that we will be working on.
Thanks, Eva. Kimberly, then Sylvia.
With our association, we have Aboriginal specific seats on our board of directors. And I think they've been very, very excluded. And much like that was said before, the history, the trauma that was done, all of the reconciliation, we're even looking at now there's been some books written to try to have them integrated in our school system. But I would say that we have a lot of work to do in terms of integration and even knowing what's going on in our own province. We've got a long way to go, I would say, 100%. And their rates are truthfully even worse than ours. So if I look at terms, and you can go on the Coasters website, our 2 Aboriginal communities are facing like 70% unemployment rates. So it's really atrocious. And there's 2 population demographics, because when Quebec forced the education system to turn French, the older people speak English, the younger people are speaking French. Their common language is Montagnais. So you have 2 demographics. When you go in and you have a meeting, you have to have it in both languages, because they don't speak common language. Their common language is their language here. So there's a lot of affected by what politics happen with the education sector.
Thank you, Kimberly. There are a couple of comments in the.
Could I?
Oh, sorry, Sylvia, I didn't see.
Sorry,
that.
So I want to build on a little bit on what Kassandra said and my other colleagues here. There's this understanding in French of an expression, le par et pour, and it doesn't really translate well into English, by and for. But every community wants their own way of doing things. They want to study things in their way with their research. So the delicate balance of partnership here, and Kassandra said it a little while ago, she said, don't build something and then ask us to come in, right? We have to find a way early in discussions for each of us to make space for the other. And I think over the years, certainly QCGN with people on the board and other partnerships, we found ways of speaking with the Black community and other ethnically diverse communities, and we're still finding our way with the Indigenous. And it's a work in progress. But the par et pour, by and for, is very, very, we can't one speak for the other. And so we find that delicate partnership around speaking with one voice, but with different perspectives. I think that's our challenge in the English-speaking community, with the wish that each of us speak with our own voice. And that goes for geographic representation, it goes for women and men, it goes for others, but it's mostly particularly delicate in Indigenous and different racial communities. There you go.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I want to thank Kimberly, Kassandra, Nicholas, and Tino for being here today and for your very valuable insights based on so much experience and strategic awareness of how to operate in a very complex political and social environment. These are big questions. Your input or expressions of knowledge are so much valued. So on behalf of QCGN, I would like to wrap up this panel to thank everybody for attending and for participating and speaking. And Sylvia, maybe you can mention to the group, if you're the right person to put you on the spot, to tell people what to expect next with the policy forum today. Thank you. You're on mute.
Taking myself off mute would be the first thing I should do. So thank you, Lorraine, for excellent moderating skills. And thank you to each of you of the panelists. As Lorraine said, we learn a lot by talking to each other this way. And I think I'm going to offer to the panelists a debrief next week. Maybe sew together some of the things we learned today. And that would be a nice way to proceed as well in terms of the debrief next week. And get back to all of you around what these conversations have meant to us at the QCGN and could mean to you as a community.